Welcome to Communist Controversies. My name is Claudia Bickel. I'm the development coordinator at the Montana Historical Society. The lives of Willis Wright and Helen DeMark and the roles each of them played in Montana political history expand our knowledge of the history of radicalism in the state. And we're very fortunate to have Megan Sanford and Dr. Vernon Pedersen here. They're going to present at the same time. I just found that out this morning. And in Comradely Yours, Willis Wright and the Communist Party in Montana, that's the title of Megan's presentation. She chronicles Wright's career from his rise to leadership in the Montana Communist Party to his fraught relationship with Eastern Montana Party organizer Ella Reeve, mother, Bloor. And then in Disruptive Influence, Helen DeMark and the Montana Communist Party, Dr. Pedersen traces DeMark's destructive path through the party, first as a district secretary in Great Falls in 1932, and then again as an anti-communist crusader in the 1950s. And I'll just give you a brief bio of both the presenters. Megan Sanford is the archives administrator at the Cascade County Historical Society. She received her bachelor's degree in history from the University of Providence in 2012 and was actually a student of Dr. Pedersen's, I just found out, and a certificate in public history in May of this year. She has been in her position at the Cascade County Historical Society for 9 years and served 6 years in the Montana Army National Guard. And Dr. Pedersen, who flew here from Dubai 2 days ago, so flew in for this conference, is a professor of history and former head of the Department of International Studies at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. He received his PhD from Georgetown University and has previously taught at the University of Providence in Great Falls and at the American University in Bulgaria. His books include The Communist Party on the American Waterfront and The Communist Party of Maryland. His recent articles focus on the history of the Communist Party in Montana and study of the American volunteers who fought in the Spanish Civil War. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. I just want to give you a brief introduction to the subject. Megan and I, for the last over 10 years, have been working together researching a book on the history of the Communist Party in the state of Montana, which is much bigger and more interesting than most people believe. The story we're telling today is just one instant from the middle of a much, much larger project. But it tells the story of how two lives within the party interacted and engaged in acts of mutual destruction. It gives insight into the lives of radicals in Montana during the Great Depression. Talks about the relationship between local party organizations on the ground and the national party organization as seen through the actions of Mother Bloor, who's a very famous communist and a founder of the party. And it also touches upon the issues of where anti-communism comes from, much of it out of the Communist Party itself. We're going to, since our characters' lives interact, our papers interact, Megan's going to start, I'll pick up, then back to Megan, and back to me for a big finish. So without further ado, it's all yours.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start with Willis Wright. Willis Wright was born in 1869 in Illinois. He married his wife Mary in Minneapolis, and him and their 2 children arrived in Great Falls in 1914. He was a carpenter. He worked for the Great Falls Labor Company, and everything was beautiful. I mean, Great Falls was a booming town in the early 19-teens. Everything was being built. In fact, 1914 is when the Carpenters Union Hall was built. So everything was going well until we arrive at what most of us know as the beginning of the Depression for Montana. Wright, as part of the becomes involved heavily in the labor movement of Montana. But in the teens, after the flourishment of the late part really is what starts hurting Montana. Several events, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company is becoming very corrupt and causing all kinds of labor issues around the state. World War I comes into play. We lose tons of men to the effort. Montana, as many of you may know, gave more men per capita than every other state in the Union during World War I, and a lot of those men did not come back. There was also the issue of the drought that happened, which caused half of the farmers and homesteaders in the state to leave. Now, Wright coming to Montana and seeing a bright future, and then watching as farmers and union people, everybody just like him, is getting crushed by the happenstances of what's going on in Montana at this time. To give you a little more background at this point, this is when communism starts coming to Montana. Over in the northeastern part of the state, we have the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota and our very famous friends in Plentywood. We've got Red Flag Charlie Taylor starting the Producers News newspaper. And I know many of you probably know that particular story. Down in Butte, we have Wild Bill Dunn starting the party down there. And eventually he goes on to start the Daily Worker, which is the communist paper for the entire country. All these circumstances, we believe, are what led Wright to be radicalized. He officially shows up in the party records for the United States by name in April of 1927. He is now a commie. He is running a paper in Great Falls called Great Falls Labor Topics, which is one of those little local union papers. Because at that time, if you wanted to get out your beliefs and find others like you, you had a newspaper. At this point, the party sends Stanley J. Clark to join Willis there in Great Falls. They see Great Falls as the beginning of building the party in Montana, seeing that there was a bright future for the Communist Party in Montana. Stanley J. Clark, before his stint in Montana, had been roaming all over the country doing speaking tours on behalf of the Communist Party, visiting with farmers' unions and that sort of thing. And of course, like every good communist during this time period, Willis Wright is helping selling subscriptions to the Daily Worker to get others involved, to share his ideology, and find others like himself that can join the party. He's slowly moving up the ranks. And in July of 1927, he is reporting to the Producers News about the Montana Federation of Labor convention that's going on. By 1928, Wright is the chairman of the canvassing board for the Montana Federation of Labor. He's busy getting in fights with
not physical,
political fights with a gentleman named Stephen Eli. So in the labor movement, there's kind of two parties, the ones that the communists are following and everybody else. On the other side of that is those who followed Burton K. Wheeler. At that time, the communists felt that Wheeler was just a front man. He didn't actually fight for the cause of the communist people or the daily workers or any of that stuff. So they didn't like him. And Stephen Eli, who was elected as president of the Montana Federation of Labor, was a Wheeler man. He was also from Stockade. But during all of this, like I said, he's on the canvassing board. He tampers with the ballot. They were trying to get a different gentleman in position for president of the Montana Federation of Labor. They called him a political buccaneer in the paper as they were talking about this. Let's see. In January and February of 28, there's a write-up that the Producers News reproduces from the United Farmer of Bismarck, North Dakota, that Wright wrote, specifically laying out his beliefs and the beliefs of the Communist Party for everyone to see. It was anti-Wheeler, anti-Anaconda Copper Mining Company, and anti-Montana Power. They specifically said that they were robbing Montana of its natural resources and not giving it back to Montanans. He was specifically looking at Gibson Dam being built and how that became a private interest rather than a public interest. Also during this year, he was a representative for the Cascade County Board of Trade. Even though he was a communist, even though he was out as a communist, not entirely, but getting close, he was a good labor man. He actually cared about the people that he was helping. He was a labor person who happened to be a communist and not a communist who happened to be a labor man. But as a representative for the county board of trade, he was then sent to a Montana Federation of Labor meeting in Roundup where they refused to seat him. The reasons that they didn't seat him is they claimed that the Great Falls Labor Topics paper was a communist organ, which it was. But their way of getting around it was saying that they claimed since he was part of the Carpenters Union and that the Carpenters Union was not in good standing with the Federation of Labor at that time. So they decided to exclude him, and they actually called him a Judas Iscariot in the description. But yeah, this is where you're seeing a lot of that factionalizing in the labor movement of who's anti-Wheeler and who's a communist. So we now get to August of 1928. In the Daily Worker, they're looking at the Communist Party in Montana, and they're saying that the prospects indicate a large vote in the state of Montana for the party. This is the first year that the Communist Party is actually on the ballot in the state of Montana. It's under the Workers' Party, but it also says in parentheses communist, so I don't know why they just didn't put communist. We also know for sure that they were communists and not the Workers' Party, because two of the presidential electors are Stanley J. Clark and Emma Salisbury, who we all know as Rodney Salisbury's wife. As we arrive at 1930, Wright has risen to being a district organizer. He is the district organizer for the state of Montana. He's working out of Great Falls, and when you're a good communist, you get awarded with being, what's the right wording? Put into positions even though they don't expect you to win your election.
Oh, yeah, you get nominated for public office.
Yeah.
And the higher the office shows the better standing you have in the party.
They didn't expect him to win, but you know, it's kind of cool when you can say, yeah, I ran for US Senator. So like I said, at this time, he's district organizer. He is the candidate for the US Senate on the communist ticket for the state of Montana. He's also the chairman of the Montana Communist Central Committee, and county auditor for Cascade County. Again, this is just more evidence of he actually cared about the people he was trying to help. He cared about the working man and the labor movements that were going on. And I don't know if a county auditor is an elected position or you're chosen, but still somebody had faith in this guy despite his beliefs. He was also working with the unemployment program, because of course by 1930, depression's full on going. It wasn't as bad in Cascade County in Great Falls as some of the other places around the state, but they were taking notice at this point. And even though this man is candidate for US Senator, he's still putting it in permits to go speak on street corners. to still get people involved, to still hand out pamphlets and everything. In October, there's an article that appears in the Daily Worker, and we're seeing more evidence of, oh yeah, thank you. As you see here, this is Mr. Wright. This is the only known photo we've been able to find. This is from him in the Daily Worker. There's an article in October of 1930 where Wright is telling people not to vote for Charles Taylor. At this point, Charles Taylor has become a Trotskyite and on the outside with the rest of the Communist Party. It's really kind of funny. They call him a misleading renegade. But you're seeing, it's always kind of interesting how the party eats itself. So, of course, during all this time, Wright is still doing all the hard work. And he is still writing letters to the American offices and saying, I need help, I need people, we need money, we can't do anything. Because there's a lot of times where the Communist Party feels like a nonprofit. But he's doing his best in the best way he can without being shady about it. In 1931, we're still seeing him traveling to all these communities. He's having rallies and meetings in Geyser, Montana, working to sell subscriptions to the Daily Worker. He's working on helping bolster the Butte party as well. Bill Dunn leaves the party in 1919, or no, that's too early.
No, that's much too early. Bill Dunn left Montana around 1923 to take over his job as editor of the Daily Worker.
Yes, so when Bill Dunn left in 23, Butte's party really doesn't do anything after that point. It just exists.
It collapses.
So Wright has taken on doing that. And as district organizer, he's thinking, hey, Plentywood's part of Montana. You guys should come be part of us and we should be taking care of you. Everybody loves Plentywood because they are one of the few financially viable Communist Party units ever.
Well, outside of New York City.
Yeah, but I mean, who wouldn't want the one that's making money as part of their district? So what happens is in February, Wright is getting recognition from William Z. Foster, who is the candidate for president in the year of 1932 on the communist ticket. And then in September, this is where the fight for Plentywood begins. So a little bit more background. As I told you earlier, North Dakota in the Nonpartisan League is really who's keeping an eye on Plentywood because it's so far away. And it's much closer to North Dakota than it is to Great Falls and Butte. In North Dakota at this time is Mother Bloor. Mother Bloor was one of the founding members of the Socialist Party in the United States. She also became one of the founding members of the American Party of the Communists as well. When the party was trying to change and more Americanize themselves, Mother Bloor was sent and went with a delegation to Russia, and she stood up to Stalin in person and lived and wasn't expelled from the party. But she was exiled to North Dakota. And for my military buddies, it was my not. And then they moved to Bismarck. But Mother Bloor is not the person you want to fight. At this point, she is 7 years old, married to her third, much younger husband. He's 20 years her junior. And she says, this is my place. All of her supporters are there in Plentywood, and she likes them. Well, magically, a representative from District 18 sent by Willis Wright comes and says, you guys are part of our district. And she's pissed. And that brings us to the year of 1932.
And 1932, things are going to get very interesting for poor Willis Wright. And the reason for the interest is Helen DeMark. Helen DeMark's a hard woman to research because she kept changing her identity. She's quite a chameleon. She was actually born Sylvia Helen Wilson in Marathon, Wisconsin. But by 1932, she's calling herself Helen DeMark because she's living with Frank DeMark without benefit of matrimony, which back in the 1930s is a major scandal. Respectable people do not do this. So people who did, in fact, live together without the benefit of marriage, the woman would always take the man's last name and they would pretend to be married. That way it just saves a lot of trouble and a lot of hassle. She appears in the party records, however, not as Helen DeMark, but as H. Wilson DeMark. It's not unusual to take a party name because it saves problems with your work. But when Helen joined the Communist Party, she was unemployed, so she didn't have any work to protect. However, she had been working as a freelance reporter in Chicago before coming to Montana. And I actually think that H. Wilson DeMark was her pen name because it also meant she wouldn't have any problems with her gender when submitting stories to the papers. Later on, just to throw us all off the track and make our lives confusing as hell, she calls herself Helen Wood Burney. I'll explain why about that later. Helen's an interesting person. She had a very difficult childhood. Her mother died when she was 3. Shortly before that, Helen had contracted polio. Her father did not take his wife's death well and farmed out his children to various relatives. And then he himself dies very young when Helen is only 12. That's all right. Helen writes in her memoirs, I had a great role model and emotional support in my father's brother, Charles, who kills himself when Helen's 15. Yeah, I know. It's like a Hallmark movie gone bad. By her own account, her uncle's suicide completely sours her on society and life. She becomes very bitter. And as she writes in her memoirs, she determined that she would make everyone sorry they ever knew her. Oh yeah, although she goes about this in, by modern standards, a really, really mild way. She decides, I won't be a farmer's wife. That's not that hard not to do. I won't be a teacher. I won't be a secretary. Instead, she takes a course in journalism from the University of Wisconsin and moves to Chicago to become a freelance reporter. And that's considered quite bold for the 1920s. Well, Chicago, she goes to Chicago in 1929, just as the Great Depression hits. That is where she meets Frank DeMark and moves in with him. Frank DeMark gets a job in 1931 with the Great Northern Railroad, and both the two moved to Great Falls. Helen can't find work in Great Falls, so she starts attending unemployed council meetings. The unemployed councils, to give you a brief background, are one of the Communist Party's better ideas. They were created in 1930 by a party leader named Herbert Benjamin. The whole idea was to channel the fear, the resentment, the unhappiness of people who were thrown out of work by the Great Depression into demands for better government relief, and as a ready-made group of people to have demonstrations, marches, protests on party-sanctioned issues. Most members of the unemployed councils were not communists. However, the unemployed council leaders were all Communist Party members. And in Great Falls, each of the individual party units had an unemployed council assigned to it to direct and guide. So Helen's working with one of the unemployed councils, helping them to bring a speaker to Great Falls. Richard Moore is a Black lawyer with the International Labor Defense. He's traveling the country with Mary Mooney, the 84-year-old mother of convicted preparedness state bomber Tom Mooney. Mooney was actually railroaded. He wasn't guilty of trying to bomb the preparedness parade, and the Communist Party picks him up as a cause celebre in the 1930s, along with their advocacy of the Scottsboro Boys. Yeah. And Moore is bringing Mary Mooney to Great Falls to hold a series of rallies protesting the imprisonment of Mooney and the imprisonment of the Scottsboro Boys. DeMark is waiting on the platform when Moore and Mary Mooney arrive. Mary Mooney thinks that DeMark is an Irish woman and forms a quick attachment to her. DeMark is actually 100% English Protestant. Whatever. Because of her hanging around with Mary Mooney, Richard Moore takes a real interest in her, and he recognizes her right off as intelligent, articulate, and absolutely consumed with displaced anger, and tells Willis Wright, you need to get this woman into the Communist Party. Wright talks to DeMark and asks her a few questions, discovers that she can type. And not only does he recruit her into the Communist Party, but he makes her party district secretary. Because they desperately need someone to keep the records. This causes a lot of resentment, by the way, with the older party members who think she's been jumped ahead. And just to make things even more interesting, she moves into a spare bedroom in Wright's house. Yeah, I know, I had the same thought, although according to Wright, she paid rent. I'm not sure where the hell Frank DeMark is at this point in the story. Barely a week after the Communist Party joined me, that's how Helen puts it in her memoirs, she had the chance to meet William Z. Foster, the chairman of the American Communist Party. He arrives in Great Falls on a speaking tour because he's running for president. And because the Communist Party is indeed a lot like a nonprofit, he has to save money, so he's bunking with Willis Wright. The second he walks across this doorstep into Wright's house, he zeroes in on Helen, and who is that remarkable young woman with that incredible voice? And the two of them become inseparable companions for the week. I heard the gasp. For the week that Foster is in Great Falls. Allow me to quote from Helen's memoirs. For the better part of a week, William Z. Foster was many things to me. The awesome titular head of the Communist Party USA, a dynamic orator, drawing and holding large crowds with his intense, fiery harangue, an old, hard analyst who took no nonsense for members of the party, a tireless professorial teacher of Marxism. Not the lesser of his characteristics was his opinion of his own qualifications as Stadawan. He was a sensualist and egotist, sure that his highly exalted position made him the object of desire to all green and untutored functionaries of the opposite sex. DeMark writes his passage in the 1950s. She does not let her readers know whether or not she succumbed. DeMark's rapid rise to the party meets with terrible antagonism from the other party members. And when Mother Bloor out in the Dakotas gets words of it, she is also furious. This is a young petit bourgeois woman, doubtless with salacious motives, rising too rapidly in the party, and she sends her third husband, Andrew Olmholt, off to Great Falls to see what the hell is going on. Ostensibly, Olmholt is there to prepare the Great Falls district to be merged with Mother Bloor's district. She won the faction fight, big surprise. But they turned the meeting into a self-criticism session, which is something communists like to do. To tell each other what they're doing wrong, why the party is not working, why they've not succeeded in having a revolution yet. The first guy that gets up is trying to be discreet. He just says, I think we need to keep the unemployed councils at a greater length, distance. There's too much overlap between the Communist Party and the unemployed councils. People will get confused. And we don't want to let the non-communists think that we're actually running the show. Okay, he was actually talking about DeMark, but he just didn't want to say so. The next guy up, though, is Comrade James Jones. He's a truck driver. He's been in the party since the very early days. And he basically says, people like DeMark should not be brought directly into the Communist Party. They need to serve a probationary period first. So he was trying to be direct. But the person who spelled it out was his wife, Eva Jones, and I really enjoy this. She's referred to in the party minutes as Comrade Mrs. Jones. When Comrade Mrs. Jones got directly to the point, she says, why is Wright favoring DeMark? Why did she get taken straight out of the unemployed council and appointed party secretary? Why was she allowed to skim off a percentage of the money from the sale of dues? And why does she live with Comrade Wright? Wright defended himself vigorously. He said she lived with him because it was a convenience of the party and she did not get a percentage of the dues to herself. Thank you very much. And then they tabled the issue. DeMark accompanies Wright with the delegation down to Butte, where they merged the two party districts. And much to everyone's disgust, she comes back as both a member of the 5-person section bureau and 3-person secretariat responsible for running the party on a day-to-day basis. Andrew Olmholt and Mother Bloor are not happy. And DeMark does nothing to make everybody else happy with her either. She's constantly bullying the other party members, explaining to them how good communists should behave. One incident that really stands out and which always remained in DeMark's mind involved a really tragic tragic crime in Great Falls. In July of 1932, Tony Kirigas, a local bus driver, finds a guy named Joe Kaza sneaking into his backyard to steal gasoline. Kaza runs away and jumps into a car. Kirigas pulls out a deer rifle and fires at the car as it drives away, killing Kirigas's wife, 19-year-old Genevieve Kaza. Oh yeah, the crime. What's that? Oh yeah. Well, and Kaza's a member of the unemployed councils. Now, the entire town of Great Falls is horrified by the crime, and when the coroner's inquest declares that it was an unfortunate accident, there's a near riot. That's only put down because they arrest tear gas for the crime of discharging a rifle in the city limits. DeMark doesn't get involved in it until the next day, when a second crowd forms outside of the courthouse because people are not convinced that tear gas is actually in jail. She hears about it and rushes over and is shocked to see that the entire membership of the Great Falls Communist Party is there. Now, in her memoirs, she makes that sound very impressive. In fact, there were 800 people gathered on the lawn, and I know from party records there were 20 communists in Great Falls. But she gets spotted, man. And she dives into the crowd and begins berating the communists for even being there, because she says Kaza deserved what he got because he was a common thief, and we should save our energy for genuine injustice, which pisses off people so bad that Wright has to actually expel several members of the Communist Party for criticizing her. This causes things to boil over. And Mother Bloor takes a personal hand to solve the issue. Now, the big thing that the communists have been doing in the summer of 1932 is preparing for the election in November, because they want the party on the ballot in all 50 states. They're hoping for a major surge in Communist Party votes. So the nominating convention for statewide office is being held in Great Falls. Mother Bloor comes out from Minot, North Dakota with a band of her supporters. They're going to have a big meeting in the morning before the convention to discuss logistics, but instead she turns into, we've got to do something about Helen DeMark meeting. And when she says Helen DeMark, she means Willis Wright. So the meeting in the morning is basically her guys standing up and explaining everything that is wrong with Willis, everything that is wrong with Helen. Tempers get to the point that one of one of Willis Wright's supporters hits a guy named Comrade Mackey, the young Communist League organizer, so hard he breaks his arm. Oh yeah, that's not the last thing that'll happen before Comrade Mackey. Wright is removed from his position as section organizer, and he is ordered to go to Idaho to organize a convention there and get the party on the ballot. And DeMark is fired from all of her positions within the party. Now, just to show the different character of these people, the convention goes on as scheduled. Willis Wright participates, makes a speech, and accepts nomination as the representative to the Montana House from Cascade County. So you wouldn't know that anything had happened in the morning. Everything's just running just fine. DeMark, on the other hand, goes home to, surprisingly in my thought, Frank DeMark. apparently moves back in. So Mother Bloor goes home to the Dakotas thinking everything is fine, everything is solved, but she is so wrong. Everything is about to completely blow up. On the night of 28th September, so about a month has elapsed, Frank DeMark approaches Comrade Mackey, the young communist league organizer, on the street and says, "Hey, what's this you've been saying about my wife?" And then beats the crap out of him. But Mackey is a good communist. He doesn't report it to the police. He just goes to another fellow communist and says, "You got bandages?" Besides, the poor man already has a broken arm. The next night, DeMark sends one of his friends over to the house of a man named Arthur Hobler, who was one of Bloor's supporters who really lit in to DeMark and Wright at the meeting. This guy, whose name is Henriksen, says to Hobler, "Hey, we've got a meeting, we've got to go to Black Eagle. So I'll drive." So they hop in the guy's car, they drive along, he slows down at a corner, a guy named Ray Carlson hops onto the running board, just like in the gangster movies. The next corner, Frank DeMark hops onto the running board. And they drive poor Hobler out past the 10th Street Bridge, and DeMark beats him senseless. Says, "That'll teach you for mouthing off about my wife." Henriksen says, "That'll teach you for exposing our party leader," which is the same phrase that Bloor had used in reports back to headquarters. And then they leave him with the city dump and drive away. Hobler goes back home to his wife. She calls the cops. And the whole thing explodes into a massive scandal. It hits the newspapers all across the state. Some of them say it's a sign of dissension in the party ranks. Others say, "Oh no, somebody's clearly skimming money." And a few of them say, "Did somebody say some really insulting stuff about this guy's wife?" Helen DeMark is contacted by the police for her opinion on the subject. She assures them that Frank is not a member of the Communist Party and that the assault on Hobler has nothing to do with party problems. Yeah, hell is fine. The whole thing goes to trial. Henriksen and Carlson are let off because they didn't actually beat anybody, they just facilitated. And DeMark is fined $10, plus he has to pay $40 in court fees. Mother Bloor hears about all this out in the Dakotas, and once again returns to Great Falls to straighten things out. And is she pissed? She's just saying. She arrives a few days after the trial. She gathers the entire membership of the Great Falls Communist Party together, and she just completely chews them out, but she blames everything on Willis Wright, who is not even in Great Falls at this point. She says he actively sabotaged the party, he engaged in factionalism. She says he incited Frank DeMark to violence. Actually, I'm pretty sure Helen did. She says he stole party funds. Actually, that's just a standard accusation. Anytime they got in a fight with people, they started accusing them of stealing money. That he had been bragging about close connections with the New York leadership, which communists should not do because we must be modest people. But the fact is, he was a person quite as Williams E. Foster's. That he had then sent his supporters around the state to disrupt the life of the party. And she said, "I'm quite certain he has connections to the ruling class," which is the worst thing you can say about a good communist. You betrayed it. She said she was reporting to the national leadership and having been expelled. But in the meantime, she actually rallies the Great Falls Party together, convinces them to forget about all the unpleasantness. They hold over 15 rallies prior to the election. The unemployed councils hold 2 demonstrations in the city park for better relief, and even a mini hunger march on the state capitol. State capitol, the courthouse in Great Falls. So it seems like she's done her job and done it well. Helen quietly leaves the state of Montana. And with that, it's over to you.
Now that Willis has been kicked out, he's been exiled to Idaho to try and get their convention going there and get a ballot for the Communist Party set up there. And again, he's still being a good communist. He's still speaking at United Farmers meetings, going door to door. He's still doing these things. At one point, there is the Second National Hunger March movement that comes along. It's another one of the ideas by the Unemployed Council. It started in San Francisco, made its way up through, had a slight snag in Missoula when everybody was arrested. And then, but during some of that time, they stopped in Idaho. Willis Wright actually gave a talk for them, and they asked if they could borrow his car. One of theirs apparently had broken down and they needed another vehicle to keep going because the national marches are on their way to Washington, D.C. Wright gives them his car. A couple months later, he gets a note in the mail. They have left his car in the care of a comrade in Laramie, Wyoming. Apparently it was too much of a gas guzzler.
Yeah, it was a 1919 Cadillac.
Yeah, in 1932. So Wright makes his way to Laramie, Wyoming. He's working on figuring out where the heck his car is, because all they did was give him a name and a PO box number.
Yeah.
So he's trying to find this comrade. He goes a couple different places looking for him. Eventually, he is walking back from a camp back towards Laramie, and it's dusk, and he gets hit by a car. He was walking along the highway. It was dusty. It was getting close to sunset, and unfortunately, he just wasn't seen. Wright died in Laramie on December 5th, 1932. As you can see here, this is his headstone at Highland Cemetery in Great Falls. Overnight, Wright is forgiven and becomes a martyr for the cause. Because of course they're going to only remember the good things you do when you die. There in the producer's news, it said he was a militant fighter for the cause of the working class all his life. His body was sent back to Great Falls, and his wife paid to have him buried. She wasn't there. She went back to Minneapolis with her youngest son when Wright went to Idaho. And this is where we found him.
With a hammer and a sickle.
With a hammer and a sickle. And he died as he lived, serving his fellow workers. We did check into the records for the funeral home and things like that. We found that Mary paid for the plot. Couldn't find who paid for the headstone. We would really like to believe, though, that it was his loyal friends there in the Communist Party still in Great Falls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to think it was James Jones.
Yeah, you think he did?
So that brings us back to Helen DeMark. Now, when William Z. Foster was hanging out with Helen, he told her that Mother Bloor did not like her rising in the party as rapidly as he had. But he said, you know what, if she gets to be too much trouble for you, I'll look after you. And apparently he did, because instead of getting kicked out of the party, she appealed to the guys at headquarters and was reassigned to Iowa, where she worked for the International Labor Defense, made a reacquaintance with Richard Moore, and made a bit of a career working in various cities around the Midwest for the next 2 years, mostly with civil rights cases. But as she writes in her memoirs, and you got to take Helen's memoirs with a grain of salt, she became more and more disillusioned with the party because she felt that party leaders were too focused on inter-party politics and not focused enough on social justice causes. At one point, she openly defies the party by becoming involved with a court case that they felt was a losing proposition and didn't want to waste their time on. And she is taken into a back room and severely disciplined, which just means verbally criticized. But it makes her so mad, she resigns from the party. And at this point, her trail goes ice cold. Very, very little is known about what happens to her next. What I do know, I got a guide from one of her great niece's genealogy sites. In the late 1930s, she married a man named Charles Edward Dennison and had 3 children by him. Dennison died in 1942 at the very young age of 35. She then married the Reverend Charles Wood, but apparently that did not go well because she divorced him in 1945. So that's a quick turnaround. In 1947, she married David Burney, who adopted her children, and this is why later on in life she's known as Helen Wood Burney. Dennison just disappears. I guess the name got too long. But in 1951, the second Red Scare begins in America, and Senator Joseph McCarthy holds up his famous list of 150, or was it 50, or was it 67? I just remember prominent communists that have infiltrated the American government. And Helen feels that she's got a story that she can tell and add to this. In fact, she gets national attention. In 1954, she testifies before the House Committee on Un-American Activities about her membership in the Communist Party back in the 1930s. And the John Birch Society takes her on a series of nationwide tours, including Montana. She returns to Montana in 1959 and travels to virtually every single community in the state. This is just one example of the advertisements for her speaking tour. But she visits tiny towns up on the High Line. She visits towns up and down the Bitterroot Valley, and she comes to Great Falls as well. She's got kind of a selective memory. Well, for example, she was in fact party secretary, but that meant she was in fact the party's secretary. She handled the records, she kept track of dues payments, she ran the mimeograph machine. But in the 1950s, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the guy in charge is Joseph Stalin, who calls himself the General Secretary. So she takes a little liberties and said, I ran the Montana Communist Party for 9 months. She did not. She also makes a big deal about the tear gas crime case by saying that she personally prevented a lynching and that there was in fact a noose strung over the railway near the courthouse, and they were going to drag tear gas out and hang him, but she stopped them. The Great Falls Tribune tells a very, very different story about that riot. However, and she also completely and utterly edits Frank DeMark out of her life. And her memoirs just says that DeMark was her party name. Mentions nothing about the fact that her real party name is H. Wilson DeMark. However, there are still communists in Montana in the late 1950s. And 2 of the most close fellow travelers, not communists, but very sympathetic to the party, very sympathetic to its goals, are Harry and Gretchen Billings, the editors of the People's Voice, newspaper out of Helena. And DeMark terrifies them because they know she was in Montana right about the time when a lot of the members who are now semi-hidden were open, and they're afraid she knows where too many bodies are buried. In the Harry and Gretchen papers in Billings, there's a whole series of letters sent to them by their friends tracking DeMark's visits around the state and letting them know what she's saying and what she's not saying. And everybody's quite relieved that she's mostly just talking about how awesome she was and how awesome she is now, and not trying to dig up any skeletons that are buried around Montana. Helen DeMark eventually retired to California, where she died in 1975.